I'd like to start by saying I think the perspective of my talk might be slightly different to any we've heard yet this afternoon or this morning. I think I've got a little bit of a... Is that better? I think I've got a bit of a different emphasis from the papers we've heard previously. We're talking about linguistic rights, and the papers have addressed what linguistic rights would mean and what linguistic research will mean. I want to look at the challenges to linguistic rights. Not because I go along with these challenges, but I think it's very important that we're aware of challenges as well as the positive things that go on. So in the past 40 years have been a period of dramatic change in the role of sign language in deaf education. And I would like in this paper to look at these changes and to examine two periods when sign language in education have been under attack, and to put these in context. The first attack, which we probably all know, was the argument that sign languages are just not proper languages. And the origins of this view can go right back to the 1880 Milan Conference. You'll be relieved to hear that I'm not going to go back to 1880, but I'd just briefly like to mark the 1960s and 70s as a time when sign languages were not recognised as proper languages, and in most countries were not seen as having a role in the education of deaf children. As one lecturer responsible for the training of teachers of the deaf put it, the signs in general use do not follow a system of rules and therefore cannot be regarded as a language. And that was in 1976. For most educationists at that time, any use of signs was seen as detrimental to language development and education. And I think it's important to realise how strongly these views were held. So I just want to quote briefly from two pieces of advice to parents in the 1960s. And the first one: the use of signs is a very primitive form of communication and creates a barrier against correct and fluent communication between adults and the profoundly deaf child. It's an easy way out for an adult and expects very little in return from a child. And the second quote: if you want your child to talk in a normal way, you must speak to him as you would to any young child, not in an unnatural way. If you persist in using gesture or pantomime, he will not trouble to learn to talk. After that, you're going to find it difficult to establish good speech as a means of communication. In order to compete and conform as an adult, good speech is essential. Pretty strong views, I think, for the 1960s. And it will be very easy to find very many quotes like that. It's interesting, I think, to note, as we're here in Russia, that for some of the period prior to 1950, the education of deaf children in Russia followed a slightly different path. One of the great psychologists of all time, the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, was interested in deaf education and had a positive attitude to signs. In the 1930s, Vygotsky was saying that sign language was a genuine language with all the richness and function of such a language. And we shouldn't take a lofty, contemptuous view of sign language and not treat it like an enemy. I do quite like that. He said, that which we take away from deaf children in communication, that which we take away from deaf children in communication will also be deficient in their thinking process. At a conference on deaf education in the Soviet Union in 1938, sign language was acknowledged as a necessary part of the educational process for deaf children, and there were the beginnings of a bilingual approach. All of this was overthrown by Stalin in his publication on language, which was in 1950, where he said the manual language of deaf people is not even a surrogate language. Inevitably, the Soviet Union then became a country with an oral education policy, and with deaf children, the oral approach was then dominant throughout deaf education. However, through much of the developed world, changes in deaf education started to occur in the 1970s and 80s. Mainly, I think, because concerns about the poor attainments of deaf children were growing. There was also a growing body of research regarding the significant achievements of deaf children of deaf parents. And this suggested that at very least sign language did not impede development, which had been previously suggested. This resulted firstly in signs being used with speech, in an approach which could be known as sign-supported English, or sometimes known as total communication, known by deaf people as not total and not communication. Later on, a number of teachers campaigned for the move to using a full sign language, and as using separate languages from the spoken written language and the sign language of the community. A major impetus for this was the growing body of research establishing definitely that sign languages were full, complete and evolving languages with full linguistic properties. In a number of countries, the sign language of that country, together with the written spoken language, was adopted in an approach to education known as the bilingual education or the sign bilingual education. Sign bilingual education was first implemented in the UK in the early 1990s, as in many European countries and the USA. It also began in Russia at about the same time. I was fortunate enough to be involved in the developing programs in both the UK and in Russia. And at first there was enormous optimism, and teachers themselves were delighted to be teaching deaf children in a language that enabled the pupils to access the curriculum. Teachers also commented not just on access to learning and access to the curriculum, but also the developments in self-esteem and in self-confidence that they saw in the children. There were, of course, major issues to resolve. Bilingual education was not simple, even from the beginning. Some of the issues were, can you use bilingual education in mainstream and also special schools? What are the implications of deaf and hearing people working together in schools? Is there a place for spoken language in bilingual education? What should we do about the specialist vocabulary terms required by the full curriculum? How should we develop these and who should be involved in this? Particularly important was how should parents be encouraged to develop their signing skills and develop the proficiency they needed to communicate with their children. But these issues, I don't say these to detract from sign bilingual education, but these debates added much to the process, and it was a very exciting time, I think, in deaf education. But, and there's always a but, at the same time there were developments in the world beyond deaf education, which would have consequences for this view of deafness, and in particular sign language. And these were to have a significant impact on the future of the bilingual approach. The internet, social networks, mobile phones, text messaging had enormous benefits for deaf people in Europe and Russia and throughout the world. However, a consequence of this in the UK is that deaf clubs, where deaf people meet together, no longer have the central role in deaf people's lives that they've had in the past. In general, of course, attitudes to disabled people have been changing. Their rights and their access into mainstream society has been the goal, although this is probably not as apparent in Russia as it is in the USA and Europe. The major impact, however, in all of this has come from advances in medicine and technology. The impact of digital hearing aids, of bone-anchored hearing aids, of STEM systems, and in particular cochlear implants, has meant that many more deaf children, and in particular deaf people, and in particular deaf children, now have greater access to sound and greater access to spoken language than previously. The majority of deaf children who receive a cochlear implant gain useful hearing, such that they can acquire spoken language through hearing. So we now reach the second threat to sign language, which I mentioned at the beginning of the paper.
I would like to focus more on Sweden, and you might know that we have more than 30 years of experience of bilingual teaching in deaf schools. And I would like to share some results in those 30 years. Do we see any improvements? Are deaf people equal to hearing people in society? So I leave you with that question now, and I will give you an answer later. So let me now start my presentation. First of all, I would like to give you some background. Russia is a vast country. You have a lot of citizens. Sweden is very small. We are approximately 9 million people and 8 to 10,000 deaf people. So we are small, and the number of deaf children is about 500 that are in school. 500 deaf children in deaf school. So we are quite small. I just want you to keep that in mind when you listen to me. So that's an important piece of information. I also would like to give you a definition on bilingualism and who is bilingual. And one definition that I use is that bilinguals are those who use 2 or more languages or dialects in their everyday lives. It could be 2 languages or more. So that's one definition. Deaf bilinguals, they are having languages of different modalities. It's spoken, written, or signed. And the group of deaf, you could say that 5 till 10% are born into a deaf family or have deaf parents. The vast majority are brought up in hearing families. So, regarding language exposure, you can say if you're brought up in a deaf family, you will be exposed to sign language very early. The situation is different if you're brought up in a hearing family. The main part of deaf children attend deaf school, and we have a tradition of that in the Scandinavian and Nordic countries, as you might know. We can't say that we see balanced bilingualism. We have a strong sign language skill or knowledge.
Он часто говорил, все для нас, но без нас. Я об этом уже много раз говорила, еще раз хочу обратить ваше внимание общества на самую главную проблему. На самую главную проблему жизни любого человека, за пробел в его обучении и в развитии. Это период, пробел, дыра, который влияет на всю дальнейшую жизнь любого человека. Это период от 0 до 3 лет. Мы уделяем большое внимание развитию духовных устроений. Как же это же детский сад, школа. А до 3 лет. Но всем известно, Господи, об этом уже давно было описано, задокументировано, еще в документах Всемирной Федерации глухих это было записано. Смотрите, что критическим периодом для стимуляции активности мозга является период от 0 до 3 лет. Если пропустить этот период, то мозговая деятельность может атрофироваться на 30%. И без поддержки семьи, без внимания этой семьи, у глухого ребенка может произойти очень серьезная задержка в развитии. Это закон педагогики, это всем известный факт. современные исследования физиологии мозга и по детской психологии. Было выявлено, что именно ключевым фактором к развитию когнитивных способностей ребенка это его личный опыт восприятия мира. И именно в этот период, уже в 6 месяцев, мозг ребенка сформирован не 50% по отношению к мозгу взрослого человека. Представляете себе? То есть какие-то 20-30% ребенок после 3 лет только добавляет в развитие своей мозговой деятельности. То есть этот период 1 год, 2 года, 3 года дается ребенку без всякого труда. Он воспринимает тот материал, который потом 6 лет ему будет запомнить сложно. Какой из этого можно сделать вывод? С 3 лет ребенку уже поздно. А мы принимаем ребенка в детский сад в 3 года.
Я хотела бы рассказать о использовании жестового языка в преподавании для глухих детей с дополнительными нарушениями. Учителя, а также руководители школ глухих знают, что таких детей, к сожалению, с каждым годом становится все больше. В отделении надомного обучения 65-й школы учатся дети, для которых невозможно обучение в условиях класса в связи с тем, что у них есть особенности в развитии. Многие не знают жестового языка и вообще никакими коммуникативными навыками не обладают. Основная проблема в том, что все эти дети очень разные. У них разный уровень развития и разные потенциальные возможности. Они приходят в школу 2 или 3 раза в неделю. Среди них есть дети с нарушением поведения, с умственной отсталостью, с серьезным нарушением зрения, с аутизмом, с детским церебральным параличом. И у каждого индивидуальная программа обучения. Я работаю по авторской программе. Я надеюсь, что обучение с использованием жестового языка, я уверена, что это очень важно для личностного, интеллектуального, социального развития глухих детей. По своей программе я работаю немного больше 7 лет. Я наблюдаю за развитием учащихся, а также знаю отклики других педагогов. И все согласны в том, что такие занятия для детей необходимы. Благодаря использованию жестового языка такие дети лучше понимают мир, они могут общаться с родителями, с педагогами. И, что самое важное, могут общаться друг с другом. Использование жестового языка помогает воспринимать и другие школьные предметы.